then the tough pieces will be extremely chewy. And if you cook it well done like a Swiss steak, then the tough pieces will get tender. However, the tender pieces will be very dry and crumbly, almost falling apart. And again, you have unpleasant eating. So consequently, to get good results, you need to break the leg apart and separate the different muscles one from another so you can cook them according to what they are suited for. Okay, we have the hind leg here, and this is the tailbone. What I'm going to do first is remove that tailbone. Now, this may be a little bit confusing and complicated for you, and if you are not sure whether you can handle it or not, then you can remove the tailbone together with the hip bone, which is laying right here, okay? But to salvage a little bit of meat on the back side of the tailbone here, it is best to remove the tailbone separate. The tailbone is connected. There is an invisible almost seam here where the tailbone is connected right to the hip bone. And if I put my knife in like this with a point and wiggle it around, I loosen it up to the point where I can now work on it. And I will cut some of the tissue on the inside here, and then I pull with my hand and break the tailbone away from the hip bone. And doing so, I can now fairly easily cut it off. Okay. Again, we save all the usable pieces that could be made into stock. Now I'm going to attack the hip bone. The hip bone is shaped in such a way that it is not really imaginable at first when you look at it exactly how it runs. So that you can better see what I'm going to do here, I'm going to turn the leg around towards you so you have a better view of what is happening here. And so I'm going to follow the hip bone by cutting very little at a time, making shallow incisions. And the reason for that is if I cut too deeply, I could cut accidentally into the underlying muscle. See, at one point, the bone ends there, and now I have to start flattening the knife and cutting away on the other side of the hip bone to completely free it away from the muscle tissue here. And if I would start cutting deeply right away, well, I would just simply continue cutting, stay down here, and cut off a very important part of the meat, a very tender muscle, as a matter of fact, which is the top butt. So here we just follow very thinly underneath the bone, and now we remove the pelvic bone, the hip bone. The hip bone or pelvic bone, you can call it. Okay, I keep picking off whenever I see a little hair anywhere on it. I still keep picking it off to keep the meat clean. That's important. You have to make sure you keep removing any hairs that might accidentally have adhered to it yet. At this point, I'm going to remove the shank bone. And the shank bone, you can see pretty easily where the flesh, where the meat ends and the bone starts. There is a definite line that is visible very easily. So you start again cutting shallow, making shallow incisions just with the point of the knife. Again, because if you cut too deeply, you'll be just cutting into the meat. And here on the other side, the same thing. We turn the leg over now and start removing the shank meat off the bone here until we reach the other side. Okay. At this point, there is the knee joint here, the ball. You can cut right through it and remove this shank bone. Okay. At this point, there is only one bone left in the leg, and that's the femoral bone, okay, the femur. And the femur, you can see there is a line here, a very thin line, a white line, and there is another line here. Regardless which one of those two you pick, you're going to wind up in the same place because this piece of meat is very thin, and so anywhere you go, you're going to wind up underneath. So we're going to make again an incision here, shallow incision. I'm pulling the meat apart with the left hand so that the seam is getting enlarged. And I also can help myself by actually putting my finger right down into the seam and feeling which way the seam is running, see? So there is again like a silver membrane that you uncover, and then you follow that silver membrane down alongside that muscle, and eventually this is the knuckle of the femur bone, and now you make an incision across here and start pulling the muscle from the opposite side away from the bone again, like so. And you keep going around the bone, making shallow incisions until you expose the whole bone and get completely through on the other side. And then you free the knuckle on one end, like so, and then you can lift the bone and start cutting around and free the knuckle on the other end. And this is the femur bone. All we have left now is the kneecap, which is right here. The kneecap is very easily removed by just cutting around it like that and removing it like so. Okay. Now the leg is totally boneless. And now the time comes to separate the muscles. To separate the muscles, your hand is your best tool, the best guide. Your thumb and your fingers are your best guides, because if you feel with your finger, you will be able to actually put your fingers right in between the seams like so and find out where the muscles are laying, and then all you have to do is use the knife very sparingly, and you disconnect the tissues that are still holding it together like so, and pull the different muscle sections apart. This now is the top round, which is the largest muscle of the leg. Down here, we have the secondary shank, which, you know, this upper shank here, which is near the knee, and then into the leg comes a secondary shank here, which is part of it is quite tender actually. But shanks are best suited to make a stew. This here is the femoral artery that you see running through here. And you know, for a hunter, that is a anatomy which is very vulnerable. If you shoot a deer accidentally in the hind leg and you sever the femoral artery, then that deer will be just as dead as if you hit it in the heart, because it will bleed profusely and will die very shortly after. Now the rest of the leg here, we have still several more muscles to work on. This part here is the bottom round. So we, you know, you may wonder why we call it sometimes bottom round and sometimes top round. Well, generally, as the animal is standing, then the top of the leg are the top muscles, and the bottom of the leg down towards the shank are the bottom muscles, and that's how it is called. Generally speaking, the muscles near the hip on top are much more tender than the ones on the bottom, which get much more exercise. So now here we separate this muscle out, and this will be the bottom butt, we call it. And even though it is bottom, it is a very tender piece of meat, not almost as tender as the top butt. Now there's a second kind of a round, very sort of egg-shaped piece of muscle, okay? Now this part here is the top butt or top sirloin. In supermarkets they would call it, sirloin steak out of it. In restaurants, sirloin steak is what they would call strip sirloin. This part here, this small muscle here, which is triangular shaped if you remove the other part from it here. This, believe it or not, is the end of the tenderloin which runs into the leg, which is also very tender, of course. This triangular shaped piece of meat is tough and is only suited for stew. So we're going to put it with a shank together. This is the top sirloin here, which is the smallest of the major muscles, and it's very, very tender. It's actually the extension of the loin meat, which the point of it runs into the hind leg, and that's the extension of the loin. And so it is practically as tender as the loin, and is the most tender part of the leg. So here we have top sirloin. This is, or top butt, sometimes it's called top sirloin or top butt, bottom butt, top round and bottom round. This is called bottom round. Now the bottom round is composed of two pieces yet. There is a small roll here which looks kind of like a tenderloin, but it's not as tender as tenderloin, of course. And this is called the eye of the round. That's if you're breaking down beef, let's say, that's what it would be called, the eye of the round. It is a semi-tender piece. It is not as tender as any of these three, and neither is the rest of this top round. The top round is the semi-tender meat, which is suitable best for roasting. You could, if the animal has been aged properly, you could make little medallions out of this eye of the round and maybe make a shish kebab out of it, or just saute little medallions quickly in a skillet, medium rare, and it'll still be okay. But it won't be as tender as any of these three muscles, okay? Now, the bottom round, I personally would not use it for steaks, especially not the flatter end over on this side. The thicker end here is more tender than the thinner end here, okay? But generally we use this meat for roasting. And when we say roast, we mean roast rare or medium rare. We do not mean pot roast. When we speak of pot roast, then that is strictly pot roast and not really considered a roast, okay? So now there will be further trimming, you know. There are still scraggly pieces and fat and all that that has to be trimmed off. For example, let's start with a top round here. The top round has a cap meat on it. Again, when you feel it with your hand, you feel there is something loose here. It doesn't seem to belong to it, and it doesn't. So you trim that off, and that part is very tough. So if you left it on and roasted the whole thing together, well, this part here would be very chewy. I guarantee you that, okay? How do you, first of all, how do you determine whether the meat is tender or whether it is tough? Just by almost looking at it. If you are not sure whether the meat will be tender or not. Well, the easy way to determine that is if you press it with your thumb real hard, you pinch it with your thumb, and you can see on this piece of meat, my thumb went right through. That's when the meat is tender. You can actually crush it with your thumb, and the thumb will sink into the meat. If the meat is tough, you can press it all you want till you get blue in your face, and you're not going to get your thumb into it no matter what. We are going to work on the bottom butt here. The bottom butt again has some cap meat that is attached to it, and so again using the point of your knife in more of a scraping motion rather than cutting, you expose the underlying silver skin like so. And again, you can help yourself with your fingers, with your thumb, and see which way actually the cap is running, so that you don't accidentally cut into the good meat itself. Okay? The cap meat here, again, the thicker part of the cap meat can be trimmed down and used for stir fry, like some of these pieces here. So if you trim it down carefully, some of it can be used in the stir fry. Other parts, like this thin part here and this part here, are tough, and they are strictly stew meat. Okay? And when I say stew meat, well, you could grind them into hamburger if you so desire, or you can also make sausage out of them, and so on. By the way, if you wanted to make a hamburger, then you will need to add some fat to it, because you will have all lean meat. And the lean meat, all lean meat would not taste that great. So you would want to add fat. You can add either beef fat or you can add pork fat. But if you add pork fat, then I suggest that you cook it well done. So 10% fat for hamburger. If you were to make sausage meat out of it, then you would need about 20% fat, so that the sausage would be nice and juicy. Now, this now is the bottom butt, and it still has sinews that are running through it. Again, these are the silver skins as you see them here. And if you, again, using that scraping motion here, you will expose the sinew which runs down the center, and this piece of meat will then actually break in two pieces, which there is nothing much you can do about it. If you want to remove the sinew for better eating, then you will wind up with two pieces of meat, and one of them still has to be split part of the way to get another sinew out of it. So it's quite a few sinews in that meat, see? And this is the one where there is still another sinew, as you see here, running about 2/3 of the way in. So first we remove this sinew here, the silver skin here. Again, you know, we try to keep it as thin as possible so we don't waste any good meat. And now that we get that outside cleaned off, then we can start working on this sinew, on this silver skin that's running down through the center of the meat, just about. And again, I'm using a scraping motion to expose that silver skin, and that's where it ends, right here. So it doesn't go all the way through, but it goes like 3/4 way through. And now again, I will insert the point of the knife underneath the silver skin and peel that off thinly. And now it's looks kind of like pants, you know, with two sleeves on it, whatever, two sides to it, but that's how it is. And that's now it would be fine to cut either medallions out of it or make a little roast out of it. You could tie the two pieces together with a string if you want to roast it together. This piece here now is one nice solid piece. There is no more sinew running anywhere through it, but there is, of course, the silver skin still on the surface. And again, if you want to have really, really good eating, then you would want to trim that silver skin off again. So there's a lot of trimming, a lot of tedious little work to be done. And again, if you were to freeze it, you should not remove that silver skin before you freeze it. It's much better to remove it after you thaw it out, just before you use it. Also, if you're going to marinate the meat, you should not remove the silver skin before you marinate it, actually. We are going to have another series, another tape on cooking venison, and all those things will be closer explained in those tapes on how to really cook the venison so that it will be a really nice, delicious piece of meat that it's supposed to be. So here we remove the last of the membrane of the silver skins and have a really, really excellent piece of meat to eat, because there'll be total enjoyment to you, nothing to spit out, you know. It's so unpleasant when you're eating something and and you have to, you cannot chew it anymore, and you have to finally get rid of it. And when the meat is trimmed this way, there is no embarrassment at the table. There is no need to get rid of anything. So this would be totally trimmed bottom butt here. At this point, we have the leg again broken down, the second leg, and I will again review with you the different muscles so you can identify them. This largest, kind of a nice thick muscle, is the top round. This round, kind of egg-shaped muscle is the bottom butt. The little tiny muscle here is the top butt, and also called top sirloin. And this long, kind of a flatter muscle is bottom round, and it has that roll on the side that we talked about, which is called eye of the round, and that could be removed. And these three pieces are the very, very tender pieces usable for steaks and so on. This piece here I would prefer more for a roast. Of course, you can roast either of these three also, but this one, rather than making steaks, I would prefer to make a roast out of it. This here is the shank, and this is a little triangular piece, which is also stew meat. These two are stew meats, so if you like to, you can give them to your mother-in-law or brother-in-law or somebody like that, and you keep the better parts. For freezing purposes, it is much better not to trim the meat completely, because it will lose too much moisture in freezing. So for freezing, we're going to leave it with the cab meat on it, with a silver skin on it, and so on, and freeze it in these handy pieces, which are easy to, after you thaw them, you can complete the trimming, and you can cut it into steaks or whatever you want to do with it, and then you will enjoy it much more than if you have it all prefabricated first. To wrap it, take some plastic wrap and wrap the meat snugly in the plastic wrap. That's important to expel any possible air that may be trapped inside the package. You want it real nice and snug to make sure there is no air coming to the meat, because the air will cause freezer burn. And then you get your freezer paper, which is plasticized on one side, and you wrap the package neatly in the freezer paper. Now, there is different ways of wrapping it. They call this the drugstore wrap, and you can do this also, but either way you wrap it, as long as you wrap it nice and snug, that's the most important part. And when you put it in the freezer, it's important not to pile up the pieces one on top of the other when you are freezing it. You should spread it apart so that the pieces have quicker chance to freeze, and never pile them on the bottom of the freezer either. Better have them on a rack or something where the air can get all around them so they freeze quicker. The faster they freeze, the less damage will occur to the meat in freezing. And after you wrap it nice and securely, then you're going to label it and put a date on. So we're going to write here venison steaks, and we're going to put a date on here. I would not keep the venison in the freezer any longer than 6 months, because after that, unless you have a commercial freezer which keeps the meat very, very cold, the quality of the meat will gradually deteriorate. We have covered now the steak meat mostly, which is the hind legs and the back straps. That is the steak meat. The rest of the animal is not suitable for any steaks, not even a good roast. When we speak of roast, we are talking about roast that is medium rare, medium, or so on. The rest of the meat will be either pot roasts or stew meat. Here we have the front leg. The front leg has 3 bones basically. It has the shank bone, it has the shoulder here, and it has a secondary bone here. And the shoulder, or the front leg, is only suitable for stews and pot roast. There is no steak meat in the shoulder of any kind because it's mostly much tougher meat than the hind legs and the loins, of course. We're going to bone it out, and to bone it out, you see the bone here separating from the muscle, and so you pass the knife around the muscle as it touches the bone and cut it from the bone. Then you can turn it over and complete the boning job on the other side. This is the front shank again. If you wish, you could even consider cooking the shanks while they are fresh, just like you would cook a lamb shank, but they are not suitable really for freezing, because once you freeze it with the bone on, it will not really taste that great anymore later on. So here we have the bone from the front shank, and we have a little trimming here I'm going to get rid of. And next thing we will do is remove the shoulder blade. You can see very well the ridge here of the shoulder blade. It's easily visible, and you can feel it right there. And to remove the shoulder blade, you cut on one side of the ridge, right close to the bone like that, down till you reach the bottom of the bone, and then you level the knife off flat and follow the flat side until you reach the edge of the shoulder blade. You don't want to continue any further than that. At this point, you will put the knife on the other side of the ridge, again, all the way down till it hits the bottom of the bone, and again, you level the knife off and cut the other side like that. It's not very far. You have to be careful that you don't accidentally cut too far. Now you cut shallow alongside the end of the bone, so you don't cut through the muscle on the other side, just shallow. And once you reach that, then you want to cut the shoulder blade off completely from the connective bone here, which is on top, right there. You can very easily see where the joint actually happens, and you cut around the joint, and now you can get your hand on it and again cut the flat side of the shoulder blade on the other side. And this then is the shoulder blade bone. And now there is only one more bone remaining, which is the round bone which runs through the center. And there's a little seam here, but we don't have to worry about ruining too much meat, because on the shoulder it is not as critical as it is on the hind leg. And we follow the bone again, doing shallow incisions on both sides until we pretty much free the meat off the bone. And then you can lift it on one end and cut off the bottom and side of it. And this is the round bone from the shoulder. Okay. At this point, the shoulder is completely boneless, and all we need to determine is what are we going to do with it now. Well, this thickest part here is called a chuck, and that would be on a beef, let's say. And the chuck is a nice chunk of meat, and it is very well suited to make pot roast out of it. So we take the thick part of the meat here, like so. We can even save this one here. And this would make a very, very nice pot roast. And then there is another thicker part of meat right here, so we're going to remove that also out of it. And we could add that to the pot roast also, even though it is much smaller. But these two pieces then would make a very, very nice pot roast. And the rest of it is kind of